All right, well then we can get started. I am Dan Showalter and I'm the president of the Society for Ancient Mediterranean Religion. I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's talk. And let me begin with a word of thanks. First of all, to Eric Orland for his work in organizing our talk, and then to Robin for her work communicating the details of the talk. And also I should mention she is working on making available recordings of the previous talks. We don't have those up yet. I apologize for the delay, but we will get that taken care of and we'll send out a note to the mailing list when they are available. With that in mind, I need to warn you all that we are recording this talk, and it will be available for people who weren't able to join us tonight. So just please be aware of that. I mentioned the mailing list, and if there's anybody who's with us tonight who's not on the SAMR mailing list, please just put your name in the chat and indicate that you'd like to be on the mailing list, and we'll be happy to take care of that. And then I have one more thing. I lost the screen that it was on though, so that's a problem. The, where did I put that? Details of our final lecture. Yes, April 22nd, so 2 weeks from tonight, also at 7 p.m. Eastern time. We will be hearing from Dr. Sarah C. Lungendil from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and she'll be talking about water, blood, and wine, iconography of the Old Testament on medieval portable altars. So that will be the fourth in our spring series of lectures, and we really appreciate the people who have been participating and contributing and joining in with us. Tonight, now I need to change screens again. I only have 3 screens, so that's not quite enough to work with. Now I lost everybody, that's good. 1 second. So Danelle Padilla Peralta is an associate professor of classics at Princeton University, where he's affiliated with the programs in Latino Studies and Latin American Studies, and the University Center for Human Values. A Dominican by birth and New Yorker by upbringing, he holds degrees from Princeton, Oxford, and Stanford. He is the author of Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, 2015 from Penguin, and Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic from Princeton in 2020. I looked at his info page on the Princeton Scholars, and I also noted that he commented on his understanding of the importance of public scholarship and being engaged. And there's a quote there that I really liked. This writing is motivated by the sense that writing and teaching have a vital role to play in the pursuit of social justice, and by the strong conviction that classics and classicists should be allies and champions for Black and brown folk. I love nothing more than to proselytize for classics and the humanities. And we're very grateful for him for bringing his mission to us at SAMR this evening. We look forward to his talk tonight on Pharmapolitics and the early Roman expansion, gender, slavery, and ecology in 331 BCE. Dr. Padilla Peralta.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for the introduction, and thanks to you and Eric for making tonight possible. Eric for originally extending the invitation. Given that Eric has a reference to Tom Brady in his Twitter handle, I love nothing more than stressing my New Yorker roots, even though Brady has had quite an impressive career, I must say, to the disappointment of many of us Jets fans over the years. I also want to thank all of you for coming tonight. It's a delight to see familiar faces on the Zoom screen, and I hope that one day, when the cloud of the pandemic lifts, we can do some proper hanging out in person, ideally at an SCS in a warm location, aka not in Chicago ever again. So I'll start by sharing some slides. This talk is very much a project in progress, and it relies on the cumulative force of suggestion more than it does on any one linear argument. So once I'm done, you can tell me whether you think the cumulative force of suggestion yields tangible results or whether this should be redone. It is giving birth to 2 projects in my mind, both of which orbit the 330s BCE. But I'm trying to see at the moment if, for present purposes, these projects can be welded together. So this paper's title nods to Nick Terranato's The Early Roman Expansion into Italy, Elite Negotiation and Family Agendas, Cambridge 2019, which has been a spur for my thinking about Italy in the 4th and 3rd centuries, even as I chafe at some of its arguments and conclusions. Well, at the end of the day, I remain unpersuaded by the insistence that the Roman state in this period was simply or primarily a vehicle for the brokering and resolution of gentilition interests. There is something compelling in the vision of a central Italy on the make and move that the book opens up, a vision well worth contouring and filling in further. The years after 338 BCE, when Rome follows up its victory over the remnants of the Latin League with a profoundly consequential rollout of new civic institutions and responsibilities, foremost among them the introduction of the civitas sine suffragio, the citizenship without the vote, seemed to me exceptionally ripe for re-examination. Our major source is Livy, and although Stephen Oakley's monument of a commentary is indispensable for work on this stretch of Roman history, one of the emphases of this paper is that we may need to think beyond the boundaries of Livy's own frame and beyond the limits of Oakley's commentative practice, as capacious as it may be, in order to crack some of the more riddling episodes by which history was made and unmade in the early stages of the expansion. One such episode supplies today's focus, the rash of poisonings that Livy in Book 8 of the AUC and derivative later sources date to R 331 BC. It's ultimately an enslaved woman, an Ancilla, who leads state officials to the perpetrators, a crew of Matronae who are taking their lead from a Cornelia and a Sergia, representatives of gentes that for Livy's readers will have been associated with a long history of poisoning and subterfuge, and legislative procedures adopted in response. Unsurprisingly, then, this incident has been read alongside other instances of women's collective agency in the AUC, and in conjunction with those other cases of high-profile poisonings that motivated first the permanent institution of a specially tasked quaestio, and eventually the sullen Cornelian law, de sicariis et beneficiis. The episode has also featured in scholarship on the gendered art of magic in Roman Republican culture, but taking its cue partly from Susan Frigiari's question in 1976, how many Ancillae or Libertinae appear in the history books, and partly from A.B. Richland's insights into the performance of religious identities among Matronae vis-a-vis enslaved women, this paper hopes to clarify how structures of enslavement, gender, and pharmacological knowledge all converge around the poisonings of 331. Practices of enslavement in central Italy and the peninsula as a whole experienced a shift in the final decades of the 4th century as population growth and accelerating urbanization interfaced with evolving labor flows and expanding migratory circuits. A phase change in the fundamental nature of Roman slavery seems to be bracketed by the Lex Poetelia's abolition of nexum in or around 326 at one end, and the passage of the Lex Aquilia on property and delict in the early decades of the 3rd century on the other. Recent work is thrusting into starker relief some of the major qualitative differences between slaveholding practice in the decades immediately after 338 and the Great Transformation, to use Brent Shaw's evocative phrase, of the 3rd and especially 2nd centuries. But this paper's argument will be less about the legal mechanisms by which such a change can be tracked, or about the framework, sociological or comparative, by which the change may be most profitably analyzed, and more about the epistemic and myth-historical features of that change's processing within the analytic tradition. I suggest that we study the poisonings of 331 as reflective of the transmission of novel or perceived as novel pharmacological knowledge to Rome by weak actors at a time when the botanical ecologies of the Tyrrhenian coastlines were being redefined simultaneously by Roman expansion, slaving, and Hellenization. Among the key figures in the mythic encoding of this transmission is the legendary Circe, whose eminence in the itineraries of the Tyrrhenian coast by the final decades of the 4th century, as confirmed by Greek sources from the period, offers one tantalizing datum for reinterpretation of the Roman state's concern with feminine medicamenta in the 330s. This paper will build up to this claim in 3 steps, guided in part by a reading of Celia Schultz's book from 2006, which has been very influential in the formulation of my argument. I begin with a review of elite women's religious agency in mid-Republican Rome, focusing specifically on 2 seemingly disconnected dimensions that snap together in 331, their capacity for collective action and their access to certain categories of drink. Then I turn to a close reading of the notice in Livy for the events of 331. Subject to scrutiny in this close reading are the elite myth-making that seems to thread through the incident itself, and the period of cultural formation in which the incident is embedded. And second, the motivations of the Ancilla who reported the activities of Matroni. Finally, I conclude with some general comments on desirable next steps for the species of cultural history that this paper attempts to model. Well before the late Republican and early imperial constructs of gender that are now being expertly critiqued and reassessed by Anna Bonnell-Frieden, the liquidity of Roman womanhood had congealed around a series of exemplary episodes. To name only one illustration of the ideals discursive workup, what the story of the Vestal Tukia and her sieve teaches us is that when subject to the test, the gold standard of womanly virtue is not masculine solidity, but the capacity to carry and retain liquid. That the story of this Vestal originates in the Middle Republic, even though it's hard to date precisely, isn't an accident. The articulation of a gender ideal around liquids is a potent driver for multiple aspects of cultural life in the Roman world of the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. With 331's poison drama, we are treated to the site of a discourse in formation about the gendered regulation of food and liquid preparation in the household, with liquids in particular coming under the microscope. Streaking across the 4th and early 3rd centuries is the emergence of a discourse about dietary exemplarity. Its signal is audible not only in the slim evidence for Pythagoreanism's vogue in the lifetime of Appius Claudius Caecus, or in the somewhat sturdier indications that the First Punic War was coeval with shifts in Rome's comestible historiography, to use Nicholas Purcell's phrase, but in the allocation of specific types of ritualized food preparation and consumption along gendered lines, the premier example of which is the preparation of mola salsa by the Vestal virgins. At the same time, matroni as a class were becoming increasingly defined not only by their distinctive dress and by their bodily immunity from the accosting of magistrates, but by what they could and could not ingest. The special wine Murina, assorted other sweet drinks, and gum were stabilizing during this period as identity signaling comestibles. Meanwhile, unsweetened wine, i.e. the wine that men drank, came to be strictly off limits. The policing of matronly access to wine is a theme in the earliest stages of Roman historiography, and here I offer a content warning for what follows. Pliny the Elder credits Fabius Pictor as a source for the story that a woman was starved to death by her family because she had improperly secured the keys to the wine cellar. Dionysius of Halicarnassus's inclusion of wine drinking among the faults for which a wife could be executed, according to the law of Romulus, and Valerius Maximus's report that an Ignatius Macinius killed his wife for drinking wine may also be traceable to Fabius Pictor or to Cato the Elder. This interdict on the consumption of most types of wine had ritual consequences. Even though the drink offered at pulvinaria appear to have been of the kind that matroni were permitted to consume, they were restricted from tasting the wine that was customarily offered at sacrifices, which meant that they could not normally libate themselves. Although this wisdom has been re-examined and critiqued in recent years, I'll direct folks to the work by Rebecca Fleming and Celia Schultz in response to John Scheid's claims of sacrificial incapacity. As some of these restrictions seem to be taking shape in the closing decades of the 3rd century, we can reasonably suppose that they arose in the midst of, and possibly as patriarchal backlash to, intra-elite contests over gender-defined ritual and sacrificial prerogatives. These contests will have only sharpened in intensity as changes to Rome's commercial networks incentivize the circulation not only of different wines, but of the medicinal and therapeutic know-how that was associated with them. To be sure, shifts in wine drinking epistemes are difficult to date with precision, though the prospect of bridging from the monumentalization of Venus's cult at Rome in the 3rd century to the etymologizing of Venenum's association with Venus and with Venum is tantalizing. What is beyond question, though, is that during the 3rd century, Rome's matroni become increasingly involved in public dedications and the expiation of prodigies, most conspicuously in connection with decreed spucationes, that will have involved the preparation and ingestion of different kinds of comestibles. How this religious visibility contributed to defining or structuring access to political spaces can't be spelled out in precise terms for lack of evidence, but men's anxieties about the access of women to spaces that were reserved for male civic deliberation certainly appear to be on the rise in this period. Women's collective political agency receives its most conspicuous and memorable expression in the clamor surrounding the repeal of the Lex Oppia in the early 2nd century, whose cultural ripple effects are apparent not only in the historical record, but also in lexicography. It is in the lexicography of later centuries that we see a vista opened onto women's religious agency in its individual and collective forms during the Middle Republic. Festus's lexicon contains a lemma for Beatrix, a religious female expert tasked with expiations whose competences may very well have been demarcated in the 3rd century. Whether or not a specialized and gendered vocabulary for religious agency was securely in place by the 3rd century or evolving in the final decades of the 4th, Festus's lexicon provides other clues to aid in our sleuthing. According to Paulus's epitome, a law of Numa Pompilius restricted Pylices from touching the altar of Juno on penalty of sacrificial expiation. I sidestep for now the text historicity of the Leges Regii and note only that interest in the figure of Numa and his foundational acts surges in the 4th and 3rd centuries. Strikingly, at some point in the mid to late Republic, devout women came to be known as simpulatrices, a noun derived from the name of the small cup, the simpulum, customarily filled and emptied for libations. In this connection, we might also note the bronze statuettes of women with paterae in hand that have been recovered from several central Italian sanctuaries. The term simpulatrix, taken together with the evidence of material culture, marks the extent to which Roman religious ritual enacted gender difference by mapping the identification of pious women with the practice of specific kinds of libation. Intriguingly, the lexical and material evidence seem to be at odds with the restriction that I referenced earlier on women's access to libatory wine. Are we seeing in the testimony of lexicography and in the material record a glimpse into a cultural dispensation that prevailed prior to the congealing of liquid protocols in the 3rd century? Again, while the evidence is not sufficiently granular to allow for a clear answer, you're going to hear me saying many versions of this over the next few minutes, other female ritual practitioners come to the fore in the decades before and after 331. Knowledge of the praefica, the woman charged with leading a chorus of ancillae in mourning song in front of the house of the recently deceased, seems to have reached Aristotle, to judge from one of the fragments. And in cycling through these female ritual agents of the 4th and 3rd centuries, I haven't even touched on the better documented and for that reason more intensively mined testimonies for Vestals and Flaminicae. This decision is deliberate, born out of a suspicion that too much attention to the higher profile embodiments of Roman religion's gender scripts risks skewing the picture. But to enhance the potential relevance of these ritual agents to the historical circumstances of interest to this paper, it will be necessary at this point to offer some broad brush comment on women's collective identity and its refraction through collective religious action. Women's agency in analytic history and in Livy specifically is well-trod ground, as many of you will know, from the solitary exemplarity of Lucretia and Cloelia to the collective pressure of the Matronae agitating for the Lex Appia's appeal. The AUC has been mined repeatedly for its representations of gender as individuated and as collective and as intersubjective phenomena. The AUC also offers a boost to the scholar of gender and Roman religion, of course. The authors of a now standard textbook on Roman religion, Beard North and Price, single out as, quote, a distinctive new feature of 3rd century BC Roman life, end quote, the increasing public visibility of elite women, as exemplified by such episodes as the procession of maidens to the Aventine temple of Juno Regina in 207, and some decades later, the repression of the Bacchanalian cult. In both cases, we have Livy to thank for the evidence, even if, or especially because, the notices are rhetorically embroidered in ways that complicate our ability to grasp gender's negotiation, both in his source material and in his authorial strategies for reworking that material. For those years that elude the coverage of the AUC's extant books, we face the challenge of recontextualizing notices about women's collective agency that have been pried from their analytic mooring. Thus, for example, one tradition that is preserved by Elian held that Rome's Matronae rejected Pyrrhus of Epirus's gift of clothing because it would have been impious, the Greek is anosion, for them to wear the items. It's easy to speculate about, but hard to posit with certainty the religious grounds for this dismissal of Pyrrhus's sartorial enticements. In any case, within a century and a half of this episode, not only the collective public behavior of Matronae, but even their collective private dispositions had come to be fraught with religious concerns. In the historical background to 331 stands a myth historical episode that's attached to the Gallic sack, the Ancillae who substituted themselves for Matronae when the invading Gauls insisted on their handover as hostages. Commemorated annually in the celebrations to Juno Caprotina, this incident was by Varro's time known as the subject of a fabula praetexta and had a role to play in the elaboration of an ideology that enshrined the self-denying fungibility of enslaved women in the protection of matronly chastity. The events of 331 are the first in a sequence of episodes, meanwhile, that associate the art of poisoning with women and their facility with venenum, understood to pose a threat to the impermeable male body. By the early 2nd century, Plautine comedy is hard at work capitalizing on this association. Peers of poisonous women pressed around then, as first the Bacchanalian conspiracy and then subsequent high-profile poisonings migrated from public controversy to Roman historiography. With good reason, 331 has been taken to herald an important stage in the evolution of juridical legal procedures for designating and prosecuting ritual remedies as venena and their practitioners as venefici, all eventually to culminate in the Sullan legislation. In a study of this legislation and its imperial reception, James Reeves has argued that Rome's law on magic steadily transitioned from a narrow preoccupation with harmful acts to a more generalized interest in marking and policing religious evidence. My hunch about the socio-historical ripples of 331 is that the legalistic coupling of venena with religious deviance is apparent on multiple cultural registers at once. If I'm correct, George Hupke's otherwise sensible observation that the jurisprudence of the 3rd to early 1st centuries, quote, includes very few rules regarding religion, end quote, would require qualification in one respect. Already by the late 4th century, as we've seen, a protocol for monitoring and gendering access to certain kinds of ingestibles, especially but not only in religious contexts, was rounding into shape, possibly in dialogue with inchoate legal notions of delict. It's attractive to positive relationship, however oblique, between the incidents of 331 and the passage several decades later of the Lex Aquilia, one of whose clauses came to be interpreted, by when exactly we can't be sure, as covering the administration of medicamenta. 3 centuries later, by the early Principate, anxieties about the capacity of elite women to wield poisonous concoctions to destructive institutional and political effect converge on the figure of Livia, before vaulting from her to other Julian Claudian women whose dynastic plans operated on that liquid medium. But 331 could well be taken as the dawn of a new era in the frictive interplay of gender and slavery, not only because they in material terms would benefit immensely in the centuries that followed from the happy consequences of the expansion that displaced their household duties onto the shoulders of enslaved persons, but because the multiplying numbers of enslaved persons at Rome complicated their exercise of ritual functions. In other words, 331 underscores the degree to which the emergence of Roman matroni as a collective is inseparable from Rome's enslavement practices during the long 4th century. That the identity of the Roman matroni is negotiated by explicit reference to the presence and agency of enslaved women seems clear, and Amy Richland has written quite trenchantly about this. But one might also take the incident as emblematic of the process by which enslaved women came to be exploited by the Roman state's male aristocratic elite for the purposes of monitoring and controlling free aristocratic women. We should therefore interpret the processes of the 3rd century that ultimately result in the articulation of ritual protocols around ingestion and consumption as responsive to the triple pressure of free elite women exercising greater political and cultic agency, free elite men attempting to neutralize or redefine the terms of that agency, and enslaved persons trying to survive. Their survival was conditional, at least in part, on yielding up knowledge that they carried into enslavement for the selective use and even weaponization of their enslavers, and yielding up the knowledge that they accumulated by observation of their female enslavers for the use of their male counterparts. And it is at this point that I'll turn to the next steps of my argument. Wall of text coming. Both the framing and the content of the Livian notice for the poisonings is curious to say the least, and I'll read out the English translation on this slide. When leading citizens showed symptoms of the same disease which resulted in nearly every case in their death, a certain enslaved woman approached the curule aedile Quintus Fabius Maximus and declared that she could disclose the cause of the general epidemic if he would assure her that her testimony would do her no injury. Fabius immediately referred the matter to the consuls and the consuls to the Senate, and with its agreement, the informer was given the assurance she sought. She then revealed that the city was suffering from the treachery of its women and that the poisons were being brewed by married women who could be caught in the act if her hearers were willing to follow her at once. They followed their informants and found certain women brewing poisons and other potions that were stored away. These were brought to the forum, and up to 20 matrons in whose houses they had been found were served an official summons to appear there. 2 of the women, Cornelia and Sergia, both of patrician families, argued that these were wholesome remedies. But when their informer disproved this and told them to drink if they wanted to prove she had invented false charges, they took time to confer. And then, when the crowd had been dismissed, put the question to the others. These, like themselves, did not refuse to drink, so that all swallowed down the potion and died by their own evil practices. Their attendants were arrested at once and informed against a large number of matrons, of whom as many as 170 were found guilty. Before that day, there had never been public inquiry into charges of poisoning at Rome. Matters did not stop there, as the entire incident was considered akin to a prodigium, and as reminiscent of the successions of the plebs, a remedy was sought in the appointment of a dictator for the hammering of the nail. It's not difficult to approach this passage's exposition of events as another testimony to the process of becoming political that Christopher Smith, varying a phrase from Nicholas Purcell's 2003 contribution to T.P. Wiseman's Festschrift, is tracing a contribution to a volume on the 4th century BCE that I'm co-editing with Seth Bernard and Lisa McNonan. The relay of information through appropriate channels and the securing of agreement consensus prior to the guarantee of immunity to the Ancilla Quaidam exemplify how, in the face of swirling uncertainty, the Roman state's administrative structure smoothly motored along, an impression that the repetitive and alliterative cadence of Livy's prose at 8:18:15, Fabius confestum rem consules ad senatum afferunt, is undeniably intended to convey. But the gendering of potion making is also a sign of social precipitation into a species of Hellenicity on 2 levels. For one, gender marked liquid therapeutics that in later Republican and early imperial Roman medical cultures attach to a spectrum of social identities ranging from sagai to women medical writers are already humming along during our period. It's also a time of poison dramas taking hold at late classical and Hellenistic courts, and of the rise of a historiography that emerges to chronicle dynastic turbulences where poisoning figures prominently, from Macedon and Egypt all the way to India. In general terms, then, one could take the incident to mirror trends in the gender politics of Hellenistic state formation, or in the historiography that molds itself around the project of refracting and interpreting these gender politics. But let me introduce 2 additional factors that I believe should bear on our reading of the poisonings. These are the mythographic stapling of the Homeric Circe to the central Italian coastline, and the inscription of central Italy's flora within 4th and 3rd century Hellenistic botany. These 2 developments, I suspect, are related. Anticipated in the Hesiodic pairing of Circe and Odysseus as parents of Agrios and Latinos, Central Italy's insertion into the mythological and cultic circuits of the Homeric heroes is a done deal by the final decades of the 4th century at the latest. Both Theophrastus and Pseudo-Skylax mention a Kyrkeon and a monument to Elpenor on the Tyrrhenian coast of Latium. Theophrastus is writing in the 320s and 310s when Roman maritime and sea power projection were becoming noteworthy for the first time. Whether or not visitors to this Kyrkeon participated in the cabotage religiosity that Barbara Kowalczyk has proposed for other sectors of the Hellenistic Mediterranean, these decades did see alterations to maritime sanctuaries on the Tyrrhenian coastline, one driver for which seems to be, if not the Roman state itself, then Roman elites tightly networked into the state's operations. What matters more for present purposes, however, is Strabo's characterization of the region around the Kyrkeon as polyridzos, which foregrounds the link between Kirke's myth and the region's botanical reputation. Moreover, far from being solely or primarily an extended and externally imposed script of Hellenicity, the insertion of Elpenor and Circe into the central Italian landscape was by the late 4th century embraced by local communities as well, though how volitional that embrace is the subject of some debate. Seeing as Theophrastus was plugged into folkloric traditions, it wouldn't be a stretch to credit his appreciation for the botanical features of central Italy to information from residents in the area, whether through direct report or at an intermediated remove. By the end of the 3rd century, at the latest, meanwhile, witchy wise women take up space in the literary conjuration of the region. And so too does poison. Ascribed to the vicinity of the Kyrkeon is a pharmacon with which an otherwise unknown Aulus Pilcestius and Gaius attempted to drug Cleonymus of Sparta, presumably during the latter's mercenary stint in support of Tarentum in the final decades of the 4th century. One mythographic tradition, signs of which surface in Varro and the Florentine paradoxographer, has the coastline from the Kyrkeon to the edge of Campania teeming with snakes too. But still another set of connections is possible, one whose actualization in concert with the events of 331 seems quite plausible to me. Not only Circe's identification with the region and the braiding of connections to Medea and Angitia, a sisterhood of potion brewers, is routed through ethnographic and gentilician ideologies, rounding into shape either during this period or in the decades after. One tradition, reported by the 2nd century BC historian Gnaeus Gellius, groups together Circe, Medea, and Engitia as daughters of Aeetes, while other traditions plot these divinities across the exoticized topography south of Rome that extended from the coastal marshlands to the Apennines. Angitia's connections to the Marsi would crystallize during the 4th and 3rd centuries, but, quote, the elaboration of Greek cultural elements within a Roman strategy, to make use of a phrase from Di Fazio, of repositioning local indigenous goddesses was not, I submit, limited solely to mythopoesis. It will have played a role in intra-elite self-definition as well as material and liquid vectors of social identity tapped into the herbal potencies of the Italian landscapes that were expropriated by the Roman state in the course of the expansion. It's relevant here to note that at least one Roman family claimed direct descent from Circe, the Gaines Mamilia, originally hailing from Tusculum, which has been explored in great detail by Gary Farney. While I'm not prepared to embrace the proposition that the Roman state of this period was mainly a vehicle for the enactment of gentilition agendas, the saga of 331 does unfold as Roman armies campaign in the area of Privernum under the leadership of several Plauti, for whom the tradition preserves curious and possibly Oscanizing cognomina, Ueno and Uenox. A not so distant reminiscence of Venenum, the cognomina were interpreted by later sources as an honor for that Plautius, who, a censorial colleague of Appius Claudius Caecus, had discovered the Ueni of the Aqua Appia, but another history is always possible. What were the immediate sequelae of 331? For one perceptive commentator on mid-Republican cults, a tie-in to the foundation of the cult of Pudicitia Patricia several decades later was too hard to pass up. After remarking that the, quote, implicit fact of clandestine application suggests aphrodisiacs were involved, end quote, and noting the involvement of a member of the Gaines Fabia in the incident's resolution, Robert Palmer speculated that the introduction of Pudicitia Patricia's worship, quote, was not a state observance, but a corporate observance promoted by the patrician Fabius for patrician married women, end quote. Arguably, the most consequential development at the crossroads of religion and therapeutics, however, was the introduction of the cult of Aesculapius to Rome in the 290s, mediated by the brothers Ogulni, culture brokers par excellence, as Eric has detailed. But perhaps we're better served by focusing on the enslaved woman who appears before the curule edile. More so even than the matroni whose gentilicial pedigrees come to the fore in their onomastics, this Ancilla is truly a Frau im Fragment. The Ancilla's involvement in outing these matroni is striking in light of later literary and epigraphic testimonies, beginning with a notice about Scipio Africanus's wife, Tertia Aemilia, for household tensions between free wives and sexually exploited enslaved women. And the establishment of a quaestio as a consequence of the events of 331 makes clear that the institutionalization of legal procedures for managing intrafamilial violence is underway some decades before the late 3rd and early 2nd century watershed that's been identified by Filippo Carlyle Uking. Is it appropriate to speak of the Ancilla as exercising agency, as practicing a calculated tactics of resistance? Although resistance remains a prominent theme in studies of pre-modern and modern slave systems, some cautionary notes have been sounded of late. Marisa Fuentes has modeled for contemporary historians of slavery the value of, quote, highlighting the messy and contradictory behaviors of enslaved people, end quote. Taking a page from her path-breaking intervention, let's dwell briefly on the muddled motivations and contradictory desires that may have pushed the Ancilla Quaidam to take action. Why did she bring this information to the curule edile? That she did bring it confirms that she had access to him, which in itself is not an insignificant nugget of information. At this juncture in the Republic's progression towards a slave society, it was possible for an enslaved person to access a magistrate. A fact all the more remarkable when set against the meager evidence from later periods for enslaved persons who interface with Roman magistrates and benefit from it. To be sure, there's much ado in the annalistic tradition for the early and middle Republic about what we might term Rome's bumpy road towards an open access order, in which even the lowliest of the citizens of the city's residents can and should approach a magistrate with any information that is relevant to the res publica's well-being. At one end, we have the homo de plebe, Marcus Caedicius, who on the eve of the Gallic sack hears a voice alerting to the calamity on the horizon, and who is first ignored before being eventually vindicated. And at the other, the Anius, to whom Jupiter appears in a dream to complain about an incident at the Ludi Maximi, and who does not budge from his reluctance to volunteer this information to the Senate until his son dies and he himself falls gravely ill. At first glance, then, the Anquila's negotiation of the legal system seems at variance with other episodes of juridical interaction between enslavers and enslaved in ancient Rome, as well as in other pre-modern slave systems, where the enslaved is deprived of access to legal remedies or forced to occupy a position of maximum vulnerability on the spectrum between commodified object and criminalized subject. At first glance, though, here as always, it's important to practice the virtue of reading against the grain. Was she herself ultimately responsible for the medicamenta that the Matroni were hard at work cooking up to serve their spouses? Is it more fitting to see her as an enslaved weak actor, to use a term mined extensively by Lawrence Tiltman, of the kind who surfaces in later sources as an intermediary of medicinal savoir-faire in the late Republican and early imperial Mediterranean? On this reading, the Matroni expropriated her knowledge in their pursuit of medicinal ritual efficacy, but it was that Anquila Quaidam who had the last laugh. In any case, if Rome does in fact become historical in the closing decades of the 4th century, it should not surprise us that in those same years, women's folk medicine was on the way to becoming historical as well. This history and this historical change will have interfaced with Rome's intensifying investments in the Tyrrhenian coastline, as I mentioned earlier. And the final speculation I'll float is that this woman was enslaved from those regions or a bit further south. Again, as with many of the suggestions I've made over the course of this talk, we have no evidence upon which to base this concretely. But in this situation, I think it's imperative to play up the role of imagination in reconstructing how 331 BCE becomes a point of connectivity, or imagining the interplay of gender, slavery, and ecology, and how Livy processes that in the course of narrating Roman campaigns in the Tyrrhenian coastline and further south. So with that, I am done. I will leave you with a bibliography that is in very small font, and ask that if you're interested in a full list of this, you just write to me at dpadilla@princeton.edu, and I'm interested in taking questions. Thank you so much. Amy, yay. Colin Clappin, Elizabeth Colton Clappin, thank you. Amy, you're muted.
Okay, that's so embarrassing after all this time. So thank you. That was just fantastic and of great interest to me, as you know. And I have to apologize. I missed the very first part of your talk due to a household crisis, but so I hope this isn't Coles to Newcastle. So apart from all the questions I have a small plum for you, maybe more of a raisin, but in terms of things that you would find in Plautus, did you cite earlier the little line from Epictetus 604? No, did that come up earlier? Because in terms of Circe and the scene from Curculio you cite, there's this mysterious line in Epictetus where the old man is he's disgusted with Acropolistus, who he's now discarding as his own daughter. And he said, get this woman inside, this Circum Solus Filiam, this Circe, daughter of the sun. And I don't myself know what to do with that. And you know, I said something lamely in speculation when writing about it, but maybe it fits in with what you're talking about.
Oh, it absolutely does fit in. And even though I had made use of that line in a different project, I'd totally forgotten about that line in connection with this one. So I'm so grateful that you brought it to my attention. There's absolutely, I think, a through line between this sort of expanded and rapidly escalating reconfiguration of Roman attitudes to the Tyrrhenian coastline and specifically to the area of the Phrygian, and later in the 3rd century, and then especially in the early 2nd, you know, in conjunction with the rise of Plautine comedy as a site for reflecting on these issues, the identification of women, of specific types of women, as embodying or exemplifying something of Circe's legacy. And I think that there are a couple of possibilities here, some of which I haven't digested fully in the version of the project that you listened later to right now. So one is to follow the Emma Dench line, which has been very productive for me, and to relate this poison discourse and this Circe discourse to practices in a kind of proto-ethnography, or actual ethnography in the early Roman historians. And I think that has some value, but I also feel that what is more elusive, but potentially much more rewarding, is to do what I had sketched and see if we can sort of put our fingers on pharmacological knowledge as something that is being routed through and is understood as accessible from enslaved women in the 3rd and early 2nd centuries. So that enslavement and this sort of accumulation, or rather emergence of a pharmacological episteme seem to, in my view, go hand in hand. But I love that line that you just cited from the Epictetus. I should have cited it myself.
Well, it was on the tip of your tongue.
So close.
Yeah, so close. Yeah. Oh.
Other questions, comments? Go ahead, Amelia.
Hi, thanks so much. That was fantastic. I'm thinking about the Kabirion and the way that wine and Circe is really intimately related there. And I wonder if there's any chance that, the Kabiria, or that the religious rites that they symbolize could be extended from men to women. I don't know of any evidence that, women were involved, but it is interesting that at the Kabirion outside of Thebes, you have all of these big wine cups with images on them of Odysseus and Circe.
Unmute myself. Thank you for that suggestion. I hadn't really thought about the Kabirion, but this may reflect the fact that I need to do some more thinking with Pausanias, as well as with the archaeological evidence. What I think is suggestive about this connection is the sort of potential intermediating role of the Dioscuri, and that also would bring us to a Tyrrhenian coastline context, and would make another sort of supplemental case for imagining this Hellenizing traffic in religious concepts and ideas as stretching already in this period from the Greek mainland to central Italy. And that appeals immensely to me, but I'll have to do more thinking about the Kabirion.
With the Dioscuri too, you have Helen, coming along with them in some sense, and think of Helen as preparing that Nepenthe, in the Odyssey, with her knowledge of Egyptian women's, specifically Egyptian women's, medicines and drugs and potions. That could be something coming with the Dioscuri too. This idea that they come with Helen, and with Helen's, Egyptian female connections. So yeah, I've always been struck by how prominent the Dioscuri are in Rome very early on, and why and how that happened. I mean, in warfare, obviously, but there's a bit more to it than that. I think the Romans always downplay their maritime connections, and they must have them from very early on, considering that the rostra are supposed to have been won from Antium, I think, from a naval combat against Antium that happened somewhere around 400 BC. So there's some interesting connections there. Anyway, thanks for a great paper. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for that suggestion. I mean, Antium is important here because of the link between Antium and piracy it's flagged in the 4th century as integral to the emergence of Roman state control in the area, right? And so there's a story here to be fleshed out further, and the story to which those of us working on that 4th century volume I referenced have been giving some attention, about the cultural brokerage that's practiced by Antium and by Ostia whenever we think Ostia was founded, and by colonization in the Tyrrhenian coastline area in the 310s. Here, as with some of our other evidence, we are on thin ice, but there is, I think, a pretty vibrant relationship between piracy, enslavement and its dynamics on the coastline, the rise of Antium and Ostia and conflicts in that area as the Roman state intensifies things like colonial foundation or large-scale landscape projects, right? So, I mean, this is something that will really come to the fore at the end of the 4th century with the redevelopment of the Pontine Marshes. And so there, I think there's really space for imagining a set of cultural connections that participate in much the same discourses as those that I've been anatomizing in the paper.
Great, thanks. Other thoughts, other questions, follow-ups?
Well,
yes, Eric.
Yeah, so maybe I'll go in a slightly different direction. I'm struck a little bit, so I'm more interested maybe in the Livian accounts, right? I sort of really appreciated the way that all the pieces that you connected to it and drew out. But I'm thinking in terms of sort of that, other great Livian narrative about women's, religious activity that goes bad, with the informer too, which is, the Bacchanalia, incident, which, like, again, sometimes gets over discussed and maybe you don't want to go there, but it's the narrative sort of struck me as, a shortened version of it, right? Something's going bad. There's an unknown woman that comes forward to sort of clue the consul in, and she makes that direct approach to the authorities. And, then the state mechanism functions properly. I'm struck a little bit by, so then I'm thinking in terms of, the incident you discussed, is sort of within 10 years of the Latin Revolt, or the, however we want to think of that. And the Bacchanalia is within 15 years of the Second Punic War, and within it, are these in some ways kind of parallel, sort of these questions about women's place and also seeing what women can do kind of coming to the fore in these moments of like leaps forward in terms of Roman power? I mean, so I'm just sort of thinking along those lines and wondering, what you would make of that. Again, this is all Livy's projection of it, right? It's, it's not that it happened this way necessarily.
Yeah, no, I'm appreciative for the connection to the Bacchanalian conspiracy and to some of the structural similarities that bridge between the incident of 331 and the resolution of the Bacchanalian conspiracy as told in Livy. I mean, yes, his Spala Ficenia is in some senses really quite analogous to the Ancilla Quaidam, whose story I've attempted to narrate. The hesitation I have, and I confess that it's made it a little bit difficult for me to strategize about next steps for sort of one part of this project, is that I do see the sort of post-Second Punic War cultural landscape as being sort of qualitatively different from anything that had preceded it. And 202, 201 sort of marking this watershed, not just in the imperial politics of the Western Mediterranean, but in Rome's relationship with its allies and Rome's relationship with other Italian communities. And it's clear that in the course of the 2nd century, there are these multiple incidents that involve poisonings, that involve the trajectories of enslavement up and down the peninsula, pastoral transhumance, and the relationship between the Bacchanalian conspiracy is something that seems to come into focus in the decades after the suppression of the conspiracy. And so given the contingent circumstances of the early decades of the second century, I've tried to avoid mapping those onto the events in the late fourth. But I mean, there are obvious affinities, right? And Livy, for his part, is intent on underscoring the affinities. So as part of the interpretation of the passage, I mean, I think it is important that we attend to how Livy's reconstruction of the episode is mirroring, anticipating the elaboration of the Bacchanalian narrative that will come many, many books later. So
it makes me think, and I think part of this discussion makes me think that the late 4th century, I wonder to what extent it's a similar kind of qualitative leap forward, although it's more contained within Italy in ways that we just don't understand because of the lack of sources and sort of the information. I think this is where, but we know that there's this sort of series of what look to be fairly important changes that happen in the 4th century, and you've helped outline some of those. And I guess this is just to say I'm really looking forward to the volume that you guys are putting out and kind of rethinking this whole period, because I think there is probably more there than we allow, just because we've relied too much on Livy. We haven't looked at other sources. We haven't thought about it deeply. So, maybe, in 5 or 10 years, it'll map a little bit better. Amy wanted to say something.
If I can just follow up on what you said, I think in terms of the structural similarities between the two accounts, especially with the informant, the slave woman informant, and the similarity between that account and Salem, for example, and other witchcraft informing situations. I think one thing that's helpful here is Rebecca Langland's work on exemplary literature and the ways structures float. And I think that it like kind of takes the taint off the repetition of the story. And so it's the structure itself may be somewhat spurious, but the event itself need not be in doubt because of that. At least I hope that's true.
Oh, thanks for the suggestion to think more carefully about Rebecca Langland's work. And to circle back quickly to Eric's comment just now about the sort of great leap forward in the 4th century. I and the other contributors to this volume that I mentioned do see the late 4th century as incredibly creative and innovative. And one of the sites for innovation is precisely in exemplary discourses, right? So it's, I think, quite sort of in line with one of the objectives of this particular project, to trace the float, the maritime float of these structures of representing the past and of incidents in the past, especially these incidents that we see in Livy, and that the fact that we have these exemplary structures in place doesn't vitiate the historicity of these episodes. I mean, I think it simply underscores how these episodes were processed within discourses. They were made tangible and apprehensible to future generations of Roman readers through discourse. I mean, and that's totally fine for my purposes, I think.
Okay. I wonder if follow up too on that, in that there's also this discourse and trope of the woman betraying the city, the woman who comes to the gate and lets the army in. And I think there's a couple of examples of this in Livy where there's, Matrona, but there could also be examples of Ancilli, who are the ones who come and open the gate. And this is in Greek historiography too. And I'm also just thinking, we have the Greek historiography, and also we shouldn't discount the possibility that there are Punic influences here too, especially about poisoners and women. Thinking about the Punica of Plautus, and also about Libya and Cyrene, and how famous Silphium was there. Anyway, just sort of throwing a lot of things out there, but that's following up on that.
You know, I'd love to think more about the Punic dimension here for a couple of reasons. The first is that, as the Romano-Carthaginian treaties make clear, one of the sites for contestation in this same period is the maritime relationship of Rome and Carthage. And, you know, depending on, you know, whether we believe that one of the Carthaginian treaties is renegotiated in the 340s or thereabouts, we're in the ballpark of the incident of interest to me, right? And this treaty does, you know, to judge from Polybius and Diodorus Siculus, attempt to break or rein in some aspects of predatory practice. And again, you know, piracy is the crucial thing here, that were intimately embedded in circuits of enslavement. So, you know, thinking about the Punic connection could be and will be productive for the next stage of the project. Cyrene is important too. Something I was trying to get my head around the other day was just the sort of surging importance of Cyrene in the final decades of the 4th century. And here I have in mind Alain Bresson's article on the Cyrene Grain Edict and how these sort of networks of connectivity that we see laid out in the Grain Edict make abundantly clear how important Cyrene is to commercial networks in the Mediterranean. But as you also pointed out, here is where we really do need to drill down further and take into consideration Silphium's importance in early Hellenistic, middle Hellenistic commerce and exchange, and Cyrene's enduring reputation as the place from which you can get the best Silphium. So I think that's amazingly productive as a way of thinking through more of the cultural interstices of this period.
So I think we will call an end to it there. Danelle, thank you again so much for sharing with us this evening, and thank you for all for participating. And again, I remind you, in 2 weeks, we will have our next lecture. So make sure that's on your calendar, and have a good evening.
Thanks, folks. Thanks so much for coming out.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danelle.
Thanks, Danelle. That was
Thank
great.
you. It's great to see you.
I'm going to email you.